Well, good morning once again, everyone. I'm the Reverend Derwin Kostanak, the priest at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Calgary. And not only am I welcoming you once again to this now sixth and final sermon in our six-part series through Romans chapter 5 to 8, but it is also the last sermon that you'll hear from me on this website or on our YouTube channel for a few weeks. I'm about to go on vacation starting next Sunday, and so there'll be nothing from me until August 30th. So that'll be the next Sunday that I'll have something posted. And so in the meantime, I trust that you will enjoy that month of August and what remains of your summer. But we do have yet to finish this series. This series has been entitled Living in the Light of Grace. And as we explore it today, I just want to wrap things up as best we can as we have been considering this important topic. But as usual, let us begin with two readings from the Lectionary. And so we'll begin with the reading from Paul's letter to the Romans. So then, brothers and sisters, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. The Gospel of Christ. Well, as we, as I said, bring this six-part series to a close, let me simply remind you of an observation I made at the beginning of this series, and that is that the timing works out well, that we're working through Romans chapter 5 through 8 for this series, because chapters 5 through 8 are their own segment, their own section within the larger letter of the book of Romans. So it works well. However, having said that, we must be careful to recognize that, well, first of all, Romans chapter 5 through 8 being its own section, nevertheless does not exist in isolation from the rest of the letter. In other words, the things that Paul had to say at the beginning of the letter play into what is being said through this section and continue on till what comes afterwards. So really, all by itself, this section is insufficient. You need the entire letter to get it all together, to get it all in, to understand all that's being said. But there's still stuff that we've learned. But then even having said that, we haven't been able to say all that there is to say from this section. We have not read every word from chapter 5 through 8, and in fact, we don't even get to finish chapter 8 today. And so by saying that, I say that to encourage you that we don't want to think that somehow there's nothing more to think about. I've been asking you to read the passages, to consider them, and we need to continue to do that and to continue to think about it, because there is a lot that I haven't been able to touch on and won't be able to touch on today. But that's okay. That's why our ongoing growth in our faith is something that really is a lifelong endeavor. There's always something to consider. Which brings me to another preamble point to make here. And that is simply the nature of sermons. A lot of times we would like to have a sermon be something that gives us something specific and tangible that we can go and do afterwards. A practical application that is plainly laid out. So after having gone through this and listened for what the Spirit of God would be saying through the scriptures to us and so on, we can say, all right, we go from here now and I am going to go and do this thing, or I am going to not do this thing, or whatever it might be. And yes, that is a goal of sermons, is to find that practical application. But at times, it is important for a sermon to be something that causes us to think about our thinking. That it doesn't necessarily come away with a specific thing to do, but instead encourages us to approach life and approach the scriptures and approach our faith and approach others and approach God in a particular way. These more theological or more doctrinal sermons nevertheless still provide a practical application for ourselves, because it is out of that understanding that whatever we do is to be done. And this series, quite frankly, has been like that. And this final sermon will also be more conceptual in that way. So if we're looking for and waiting for the last thing to say, so now in light of this, if we're going to talk about living in God's grace, here's what you do, that isn't going to be what this sermon is. It's instead going to leave us with an important image, an important concept that ought to inform whatever it is that we do, whether in word or in deed. This is what it is that we are to keep in mind as we live. So enough of introduction. Let's get into this final message, this final piece of this series about living in the light of grace. A couple of weeks ago, when we were coming to the end of chapter 7, the Apostle Paul used an analogy that I had suggested he was thinking isn't necessarily the greatest thing to use. But he nevertheless used it because he was trying to get a point across, and there are limitations in our understanding. And you might remember that this was the analogy of slavery. He said that we must remember that we have this slavery piece that's simply part of our lives, either living according to our sinful nature or those natural instincts that we have in us that are really no longer appropriate to simply live by. He said, we could live simply as slaves to that. If that urge, that appetite, that passion emerges, we just go with it. That's a form of slavery. Or we recognize instead that we become slaves to the law of God, where we understand that there is instruction that we are receiving, telling us how it is that we're supposed to live. And so rather than simply going with whatever those urges are, we instead put ourselves under the authority of God's instruction and live according to that. And so he he left chapter 7 with the fact that in my spirit I am a slave to God's law, but in my flesh I am a slave to sin. And then in chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8, he recognizes the tension here and talks more with that image of slavery in mind. But you might recall I had mentioned that, this is not a very good analogy. It makes a point, and it's important that we don't press that point too much. And now I think Paul is going to make it clear why we need to leave that analogy behind. It serves a purpose, and once we've got that point, we need to discard it in favor of this other picture. And this is what it is that Paul had said towards the beginning of our reading. He said in verse 15 of chapter 8, "You did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption." And I think right there, the Apostle Paul is wanting us to make sure that we think differently. Being a slave to God is really not a great image. Instead, by using this image of adoption, we get to see something that is far greater, far more graceful, if you will. It's something that is far more full of grace. And so, coming back to slavery, he says, if you think about it, being involved in slavery tends to carry with it a sense of fear. Obviously, when a person literally is a slave, back in that day or even nowadays, there was always a fear of the capriciousness of the master. Because if you're a slave, the master has absolute authority over everything about you, and whatever whim the master has, is what you end up being subject to. And so that certainly can be a fearful thing. To speak of slavery with regard to God makes the idea of God as master something that can lead to fear yet again. And the pages of history are full of examples of Christians who have lived only with that analogy of the master-slave relationship and have been living in fear of what God would expect of them or would do to them or what have you. The Apostle Paul doesn't want us to think that way. That's why he's wanting us to move away from this slavery analogy. Now, we might want to think, okay, well, God as a master would not have those capricious characteristics of other human slave masters. But Paul says, look, we don't even want to go there anymore. Here's what you have to think about. You have not received a spirit of slavery, again, so you can be a slave to fear. Instead, you have received a spirit of adoption. And this is the image by which we are to continue to live as we think about how to live in the light of grace. And so when we think about adoption, what we think about nowadays, of course, is a child that has been orphaned or abandoned or whatever circumstances have led to them no longer having parents. They are now awaiting someone to be their parents for them. And when a child is adopted into a family, there is cause for great joy and celebration, and of course the child itself, especially if it's aware that it doesn't have a family, is going to be ecstatic to know that it has been brought into a family. Now, sometimes a child is adopted when they're infants and have no awareness of what's going on. And what you often hear about is as the child gets older and the time comes for the child to be told or the child has come to suspect or whatever, when the awareness is made clear that we're not actually your real mom and dad, that can sometimes be a traumatic experience for that adopted child. But what usually happens is the adoptive parents will say to the child, look, we want you to understand, though, that we deliberately chose you. We looked at all the children that needed to be adopted, and of course we can't adopt them all, but we chose you. And that, I would hope, would be something that would be very encouraging and something that would be a delightful thing to learn, especially if it's understood that, I was an orphan and now I'm not anymore, but yeah, you chose me. I didn't just happen. This wasn't just a random occurrence, but you chose me. That, I think, would speak to that child of the depth of love that the adoptive parents have for them, that they said, we want you in our family. When we think about a spirit of adoption, our minds tend to think about something like that with our relationship with God. Now, we don't want to press this notion too far about God choosing us in the sense of some of the absolute views that can be found in theological circles, but simply to understand that we have been included in a family by choice, by love. But there's more to it than that. Because when the Apostle Paul is speaking about adoption, he's speaking of adoption in light of the practice of ancient Rome. And adoption in the case of ancient Rome had less to do with young children being adopted into families, but it had more to do with grown adults who were neither Roman citizens, and who were not Roman citizens, and often were people of very low estate, even slaves themselves, these adults being adopted into a Roman citizen's family. This scenario is quite a bit different. So what would happen is if a Roman citizen, and they were well-to-do and had an estate and all that kind of stuff, did not have, and because of the patriarchy, did not have a male heir, there would be a concern on the part of that Roman citizen. What am I going to do? What am I going to have for posterity? If I don't have a son, my name ends. And so oftentimes what would happen is he would look at one of the slaves in his own household or somebody else and would say, you know what, I want this person to bear my name. And so this adult male would be brought into the family, would be adopted by this Roman citizen, and then would have conferred onto this adopted person all of the benefits of being a Roman citizen and bearing the name of the one adopting him. Now imagine your feeling in that scenario. You're 30, 35 years old, whatever. You've been living in your low status all this time, perhaps as a household slave. And this Roman citizen adopts you and says, now you are the equivalent of my firstborn son. You are the one who is going to inherit all that I have. You are the one who now gets to call yourself by my name. The name of a free man, the name of a Roman citizen with all that goes with that. You get to have my ring as a seal, the signature block. This is my credit card I'm giving to you. That scenario is one of tremendous privilege. And that is the picture that Paul is painting for us. To understand that what has happened by God through Christ, by the agency of the Holy Spirit, is that we have been adopted into the family of God, that we bear the name of God, that we have all of the benefits and privileges that would go with that. Now, of course, every analogy can break down. We're not talking about how now we can wander around, I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus, I'm the child of the King, and so I should have all that coming to me. No, we're obviously not talking about that, but to understand the idea of coming from no status, and really, in light of what Paul had been saying earlier, coming as one who was a slave to our own desires, now being adopted into the family of God, and being given a new name and a new responsibility and a new role and all of this, it is a night and day difference. Now, as we think about that and meditate upon that, we can find ourselves distracted and start thinking, okay, well, what about everybody else? And what about them? And how does that work? Or, and let me just encourage you, for the purposes of living in the light of God's grace, to simply hold the thought into what it is that the Apostle Paul is saying is extended to us because we have put our faith in Christ. This conversation is about what has been granted to us. We leave the rest up to God, and that's part of what the parable of the wheat and weeds that we just heard was about. It's not up to us to make the call about the wheat and the weeds. It's not up to us to try to figure out who ought to be in and who shouldn't be and all that. That's not our call. Instead, we just do what needs to be done to see things grow. So in a similar way, let me encourage you in your meditation on this analogy to consider, how is it that you would live if you saw yourself as adopted into tremendous privilege? I would suggest that having been adopted into tremendous privilege in that way, one who would mirror the character of the one who adopted us, would not then carry that around with a chip on your shoulder with a whole bunch of pride and to try to suggest that you're a somebody now and people ought to pay attention to that. No, not at all. But now you have the opportunity to reflect the grace of the one who adopted you. Now you have the opportunity, having experienced that grace, having received that great grace, you now have the opportunity to be a channel through whom such grace can flow. That now, bearing the name of God, you get to be one who gets to make the invisible God visible. You are one who gets to demonstrate the character of Christ. If you would be one who would say, oh man, there's all sorts of ideas about God out there, the angry God with the lightning bolt and all, oh, that's all wrong, that's not the way it is. And someone says, well, what is the way it's supposed to be? You get to be one to exhibit the character of God that you have put your faith in. You bear God's name. You are one who is a brother or a sister with Jesus. And you conduct yourself in light of being part of that family. Living in the light of God's grace means certainly appreciating all that God has done for us through Jesus Christ. Absolutely, it means being grateful for the riches of God's kingdom that have been extended to us and the indwelling Holy Spirit to empower us and encourage us and enable us to continue on in this life. Absolutely, living in light of grace means to get that thought in our mind, what a privilege it is. But it also means now to understand how we are to live in light of that privilege. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, freely you have received, and now freely give. And he is speaking of the grace that his disciples had received. It was grace that they had been given, and now grace that they are to give to others. And so with this series now come to a close, let me encourage you then to explore what the practical application of this entire series would be. What is the thing that you would need to do or say? How is it that you must think in order to know how to live? Because living in the light of grace is going to be reflected in our actions. How can you be full of grace? How can you live a graceful life that is exhibited to those around you? How can you be a channel or a conduit through which the grace of God can be given to others? How is it that you can live that reflects the new family name to show that you have been adopted into a family that has Jesus as the elder brother? This is what we get to think about. This is what I trust will remain in your minds for the time to come, that you would hold on to this thought. Let us live in the light of God's grace, having received it with gratitude, and now giving it with generosity. Amen.